At last, the honor of recounting one of our most trivial yet instructive expeditions. I must present the record with precision, though my private sentiments will bleed into the telling whether I wish it or not. At the beginning, there was no reason to fear, no cause for unease, only a mild irritation that our empire's high command insisted on wasting resources upon a primitive world of bipeds who consumed greasy food, celebrated chaos as reality television, and worshipped glowing rectangles more devoutly than any temple. Humans, they called themselves. I considered them little more than amusing fauna, hairless, awkwardly proportioned, surviving less by brilliance and more by sheer stubborn accident. My assignment was simple: survey the dominant species of the blue planet called Earth, abduct a specimen, and prepare an exhaustive study of its habits, intellect, and physiology. My colleagues in other sectors had collected proud predators with claws like daggers, creatures who could shatter bone with a snap of their jaws. I, meanwhile, was sent after beings who documented their misadventures with emojis and paid currency to watch others consume insects on televised contests. Hardly a challenge worthy of my expertise. Still, I resolved to execute the mission with efficiency, if only to demonstrate that even insignificant tasks could be performed with elegance. I began by orbiting their planet, observing their erratic transmissions. They seemed obsessed with narratives that blurred the boundary between fiction and reality. One entire broadcast centered on an individual who wrestled alligators for entertainment. Another featured endless debates about who among them deserved to be confined on an island for the amusement of the masses. Their cuisine appeared equally deranged. One advertisement proudly proclaimed that sustenance could be prepared in a microwave in under 3 minutes. To my refined sensibilities, it was a barbaric ritual. Yet my junior officers giggled at the absurdity, and I admit, even I found myself momentarily bemused. It was not difficult to identify a target. In the northern hemisphere, amidst forests swollen with pine and rivers cutting through granite, a lone human had separated himself from his kin. He was in his middle years by their calendar, his features worn but calm. He had constructed a small fire and appeared to be consuming charred meat impaled on a sharpened stick. To my eyes, he seemed docile, perhaps weary, perfectly suitable for our purposes. My team assured me that such an individual would be pliant, easily restrained, incapable of resistance. I believed them. Indeed, I laughed at the very suggestion of risk. We descended under the cover of darkness, our vessel cloaked in fields that bent light and sound. The human did not notice until the paralysis beam enveloped him. He froze mid-motion, the stick falling from his grasp into the ashes. His eyes widened, but his body would not respond. For a fleeting instant, I saw a flicker of comprehension in his expression, but I dismissed it as the universal terror of prey confronted by the unknown. We lifted him into the craft, cataloging his primitive tools: a knife of steel, a bundle of rope, a container filled with dried foodstuffs. Pathetic tokens of survival, I thought, and not even particularly sharp or efficient. Within the vessel, the procedures proceeded flawlessly. The subject lay upon the examination platform, his breathing steady though his limbs were locked in place. My crew murmured with satisfaction. One noted the fragility of his bones. Another commented on the odd arrangement of his dentition. I permitted them their fascination while I dictated observations for the record. The species is physically unimposing, easily subdued, seemingly unaware of the broader realities of the cosmos. Subject chosen demonstrates solitude behavior, perhaps a hermit or exile. Intelligence level presumed low to moderate. My tone was dismissive, tinged with amusement. I recall even adding, if this is the apex of their kind, the universe has little to fear. And yet, there was something disquieting in the way his eyes followed us. He could not move, yet his gaze tracked each of us in turn, calm, deliberate, unblinking. I told myself it was nothing, merely the instinct of a trapped animal, cataloging its captors. Still, I found myself avoiding direct contact, choosing instead to study the consoles, the reports, the endless data streams. My subordinates whispered among themselves about how easily he had been taken. One compared it to harvesting fruit from branch. Another remarked that the human smelled faintly of smoke and pine resin, as though he had merged with his forest. They laughed, and I encouraged their levity. Better to keep the atmosphere light. But beneath their mirth, I detected a trace of nervousness. Perhaps it was the silence of the subject, or the way his chest rose and fell with unhurried rhythm, as though he knew something we did not. The conflict, of course, had not yet revealed itself. At that stage, we still believed ourselves in control. My arrogance was intact, polished like the steel of my insignia. Yet I recall, with uncomfortable clarity, the moment just before we secured the chamber. One of my junior officers asked if we should increase the sedation, just in case. I scoffed. He is human, I replied, with all the disdain I could muster. One dose is sufficient. Let us not insult ourselves by treating him as a threat. We departed the holding chamber, leaving the human under surveillance, his body motionless, his mind presumably numb. I expected to return later to a compliant specimen, ready to be dissected, scanned, and analyzed at our leisure. I expected boredom, perhaps mild amusement, certainly not resistance. The mission was meant to be a postscript, an afterthought following the grand battle that had consumed the galaxy. But as the door sealed behind us, I glanced one last time through the viewing pane. His eyes were open, fixed directly upon mine. They did not plead. They did not rage. They assessed, coldly, calmly, patiently. And in that lingering stare, I felt, though I dared not admit it then, the first tremor of unease. I silenced the thought at once, burying it beneath contempt. Surely he was nothing. Surely all humans were nothing. Still, the image clung to me, even as I resumed my duties. It hovered in the back of my mind like an itch that could not be scratched, like a question without an answer. And though I laughed along with my crew, I felt an inexplicable chill. That was how it began. With arrogance, with certainty, with an assumption so absolute it blinded me to the storm gathering beneath the surface. I believed the battle was over, that we had won. But as I would soon learn, humanity had only just entered the field. He was awake. That was the first fracture in the seamless procedure I had promised my crew. The paralysis beam had been calibrated with precision, checked thrice, and verified against the archives. No specimen of his species should have regained consciousness in less than 12 cycles. Yet there he sat, stretching as if roused from an afternoon nap. His eyes were clear, not confused or clouded by fear, but deliberate, observant, far too calm. My second officer whispered that perhaps it was a delayed neural misfire. I silenced him with a glance. I refused to allow incompetence to be mistaken for insight. Still, I felt the air shift, as though the chamber itself understood something had gone awry. The human studied us one by one. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly in concentration. Then he spoke, his tone level, conversational, maddeningly casual. "You're the leader," he said, his gaze fixed on me. "You're the tech," he continued, nodding toward my engineer. "And you must be the intern." He pointed to our youngest officer, who recoiled in confusion. My crew stiffened. I straightened my posture and prepared to reassert control, but I admit the accuracy of his guess unsettled me. Our roles were not written anywhere, not spoken aloud. He should not have known. He could not have known. I announced, with the clarity of authority, that he was aboard a vessel far beyond his comprehension, that he was under examination by a civilization so advanced that his very existence was a study in obsolescence. It was a speech I had delivered before, a ritual of hierarchy. Yet when I finished, he did not bow his head in awe. He smiled, as though humored, as though I were an actor reciting lines from a play he had already seen. He leaned back against the diagnostic frame, utterly at ease, and said, "The view of Earth was incredible, by the way. Stars looked sharper without the atmosphere." My technician froze. That statement was impossible. The subject should have been unconscious during transport, locked in stasis. Even if the beam had weakened, sensory perception at such altitude was inconceivable. He should not have remembered the departure, let alone described it. But his eyes, calm and knowing, betrayed no fabrication. He had been awake. He had observed. He had cataloged us just as we had cataloged him. I dismissed the thought with a wave, unwilling to give my crew any excuse to panic. I declared that we would proceed with the neurological mapping. The scanning grid descended, bathing the chamber in a pale glow. The human closed his eyes as though indulging us, not resisting, not trembling, merely waiting. When the first pulses rippled across his skull, he opened his mouth again. That humming sound, he remarked softly, it's inefficient. You're losing power through the shielding. I clenched my jaw. He should not have recognized the function of the device, let alone critiqued its flaws. My engineer shifted uncomfortably, muttering about magnetic leakage. I silenced him again. The human's comments were irrelevant. They had to be. And yet, I felt irritation nod into unease. His words were not wild guesses. They were too precise. The scans began to reveal anomalies almost immediately. Neural activity spiked in unfamiliar patterns, erratic at first, then sharply ordered. My technicians exchanged worried glances. Their instruments registered rapid adaptation, as though his brain were learning from the probe itself. I prepared to dismiss their concerns with sarcasm, but before I could, the human opened his eyes once more and looked directly into the primary lens of our observation system. His gaze was steady, intentional. He was staring into the camera. He knew where it was. Your observer's getting a good angle, he said. Should I smile? My youngest officer recoiled, muttering about impossibilities. The human chuckled, a low sound that vibrated against the sterile walls. It was not the laugh of prey. It was the laugh of someone who understood his captors better than they understood themselves. I attempted to regain control, asking him bluntly what he was. He shrugged, as though the question were trivial. Ex-military, he replied. These days I do security testing. Sometimes I break into places to see if their defenses hold up. Sometimes they don't. His eyes flicked toward the glowing instruments surrounding him. This place, well, I've seen sturdier. The chamber grew colder in that instant, though I know the temperature did not change. My crew stiffened, glancing at me for reassurance. I gave none. I cannot. The casual certainty in his tone gnawed at me. He spoke as though he had rehearsed this moment, as though we were the experiment, not him. I told myself again that he was bluffing, clinging to dignity in the face of doom. Yet then he added, almost as an afterthought, by the way, I've already sent a message. The words hung in the air like a toxin. My technician asked what he meant. The human simply leaned back, eyes half-lidded, expression infuriatingly calm. I had time during the ride-up, he explained. Plenty of time. More than you think. I demanded clarification, my voice sharper than I intended. What message? To whom? How? He did not answer directly. He only smiled again, that same infuriating curve of the lips that had first unsettled me, and said, You'll find out soon enough. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The chamber hummed, instruments flickering, recording data we no longer trusted. I wanted to laugh at his bravado, to dismiss it as the delusion of a cornered animal. Yet part of me could not. Part of me recognized the precision in his words, the ease with which he shifted the balance of control. I had begun this mission with arrogance, certain of my superiority. But in that sterile chamber, beneath the glow of our most advanced instruments, it was I who felt studied, and it was he who felt prepared. I ended the session with as much authority as I could muster, instructing my crew to record every anomaly and proceed as if nothing had changed. Yet the truth gnawed at me. Everything had changed. The human was no longer a specimen. He was a question, one I could not yet answer, one that threatened to unravel the certainty I had built my career upon. And though I swore to myself that his words were empty, I could not escape the echo of his final statement. He had sent a message. As I left the chamber, I allowed myself a final glance over my shoulder. He was still seated on the platform, still calm, still smiling faintly, as though he knew the ending of the story before it had even begun. The next phase of examination should have restored order. That was the expectation I clung to, repeating it as though my conviction could manifest reality. The human was restrained within our most advanced chamber, monitored by arrays that had never once failed to expose the deepest workings of any organism. I had filed the proper protocols, given the proper commands, and assumed that procedure itself would reassert control. Yet when the diagnostic pulses began to hum across his skull, I felt the fragile facade of authority cracking beneath me. He did not react as subjects were meant to react. Most beings flinched, strained, or whimpered as the energy mapped their neural architecture. He reclined with unnerving poise, eyes half closed as if enjoying some private performance. Then, as the lights shifted and our instruments began producing data, he spoke. His voice was low, measured, yet heavy with amusement. "You ever see that movie where the guy says, 'I'll be back'?" he asked, opening one eye just enough to glance at us. The reference was meaningless to my crew, though I noted with irritation that our translator rendered it faithfully. A movie, another fragment of their incessant entertainment culture. I dismissed it aloud as nonsense, but privately I noted how easily he twisted the gravity of the moment into jest. He knew he was being studied. He knew his words disrupted the solemn rhythm of the chamber. And still he smiled. My junior officer muttered about contamination of the data. I silenced him and demanded the readings. They should have demonstrated the simple, sluggish brain of a mammal. Instead, they revealed irregular spikes, bursts of activity that bent every model we had. The technician stammered through the numbers, insisting the human's brain was absorbing the scanning frequencies, adapting to them, shaping itself around the intrusion. "Impossible," I snapped, though my throat tightened even as I said it. The human chuckled again. "You're staring at the monitors, aren't you? They don't like what they're showing you." His words landed like precision strikes. I demanded silence, but he ignored me. He tilted his head toward the camera mounted in the corner of the chamber. "Smile for your archives. You want a profile shot too?" For the second time, he demonstrated knowledge of equipment he should not have been able to perceive. My crew exchanged uneasy glances. One whispered about internal leaks, another about psychic contamination. I corrected them with sharp disdain, but the correction felt hollow. I could not shake the sense that he was the one conducting the experiment, and we were his unwitting participants. I attempted to seize the narrative, asking directly about his history. It was, in retrospect, a mistake. He leaned forward slightly, chains clinking against the platform, and said, "Ex-military. Did my time. These days I work in security testing. Companies hire me to break their systems. If I get in, they pay me to show them how. If I don't, well, that's rare." He glanced around the chamber with infuriating calm. "This place? I've been breaking it since you picked me up." The silence that followed was thicker than any vacuum. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as bravado. But his tone was too steady, too practiced. My crew stared at me, awaiting orders. I gave none. My mind had snagged on his final sentence. "Breaking it since we picked him up. How? When?" As though hearing my thoughts, he smiled again. "That paralysis beam you used? Interesting tech. Strong field, broad spectrum. But while you were mapping me, I was mapping you." My technician dropped his stylus. The clatter echoed, an absurdly loud punctuation in the sterile chamber. I demanded an explanation. The human only shrugged. "Systems talk. Signals leak. You'd be surprised what you can pick up if you're paying attention." And I pay attention. I wanted to call his bluff. I wanted to brand him a liar. But then he added, almost conversationally, "By the way, I told you earlier, I sent a message." That wasn't a joke. The words pressed against my chest with a weight I could not dismiss. One of my officers barked that he was lying, but the tremor in his voice betrayed disbelief. I turned back to the monitors, hoping for some distraction, some shred of normality in the readings. Instead, I found the patterns had grown stranger. His brain waves were no longer erratic. They were ordered, purposeful, almost strategic. The human leaned back again, as if to emphasize how little the restraints meant. "You know," he said lightly, "when people underestimate you, it's not always a bad thing. Gives you time to prepare, to watch, to learn." His eyes met mine, steady, unblinking, and we've been watching a long time. The word "we" froze me. My throat tightened as I asked who he meant. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he began listing small details: orbital paths, satellite arrays, transmission relays, each described with casual accuracy. My crew paled as the truth seeped in. This was not a lone primitive camper dragged from his fire. This was something else. Someone else. Still, I clung to my pride. I told myself he was bluffing, fabricating, weaving fantasy to unnerve us. But then he said, "Do you really think Florida Man was a mistake? That was a field test." The translator stuttered on the term. My crew looked to me for clarity. I had none. Only the faintest whisper from the archives, occasional reports of chaotic human behavior, dismissed as anomalies. And yet, the glint in his eye suggested otherwise. I muttered that it was irrelevant, an outlier. He shook his head slowly, pityingly, as if I were a child. When the session ended, I dismissed the crew, insisting we had all the data we required. But I lingered behind, watching the human as the lights dimmed. He closed his eyes and rested his head against the platform as though he were in control of the chamber. Not I. My arrogance compelled me to believe I still commanded the situation. Yet in the hollow quiet, I felt the fragile grip of superiority slipping. For the first time, I understood the conflict was not physical. It was psychological. He was dismantling us piece by piece, word by word, smile by smile. And the terrifying part was how effortlessly he did it, as though he had been preparing all his life for this very moment. When I finally left the chamber, I carried with me a truth I refused to speak aloud. The human was no subject. He was the storm approaching, silent and deliberate, and we were the ones trapped in its path. The ship should have been silent, steady, obedient to my command. Instead, the first tremor came like a whisper in the circuitry, a flicker in the lights that none of us wished to acknowledge. I told myself it was an ordinary fluctuation, a trivial spark in a vast machinery. But then the hum of the engines faltered for half a heartbeat, and I knew. The human smile had not been bravado. It had been prophecy. He sat chained to the diagnostic platform, posture relaxed, as if he were in a chair of his own choosing. The alarms had not yet sounded, but his eyes gleamed with quiet recognition. "Told you," he murmured, voice calm against the faint quiver of the deck beneath us. "Your systems are chatty. They talk to anyone who listens." My second officer barked at the crew to stabilize the grid. They rushed between consoles, hands trembling as they recalibrated panels that had never failed before. The readings jumped erratically, red glyphs spilling across screens like blood. None of it made sense. None of it should have been possible. I demanded answers, but the only response was more panic, more noise, more doubt. And through it all, the human sat, unflinching, the still point in a storm we could not yet see. The power dipped again. This time a gravity faltered. My crew staggered, catching themselves against the rails as the chamber tilted by a fraction of a degree. The emergency lights stuttered, bathing the room in intermittent scarlet pulses. My technician swore under his breath. The human tilted his head, amused. "You should really update your firewalls," he said. I snapped at him to be silent, though my voice cracked, betraying the tremor in my chest. He only smiled, as if my authority had become irrelevant. Perhaps it had. The platform restraints beeped in protest, failing to read his biometrics properly. The monitoring lens blinked twice and then went dark, cut off from our feed. I shouted for my engineer to restore the link, but he only shook his head, pale with confusion. The system was locked from within. Then the alarms howled. A shriek of warning filled the chamber, echoing through the corridors beyond. The ship itself seemed to lurch, bulkheads sealing as compartments divided. My crew scrambled, shouting over one another, trying to override commands that should have been ours. The human's expression softened into something almost sympathetic. "Almost. Don't take it personally," he said. "You scanned me. I scanned you back. Fair trade." One of my officers accused him of bluffing, of triggering a simple malfunction. But the words died in his throat as the chamber door hissed shut and sealed us inside. The lock was our design, but it no longer obeyed us. It obeyed him. I approached him then, determined to tear the truth from his lips, though what I truly wanted was reassurance that I still held some fragment of power. He looked up at me without fear. "We let you think we were weak," he said softly, the words threading through the wail of the sirens. "We let you watch us stumble. We let you laugh. But all the while we watched back." The floor vibrated beneath us. My technicians reported cascading shutdowns. Propulsion offline, communication scrambled, weapons array isolated. Each word landed like a blade, cutting through the pride I had so carefully cultivated. I tried to rally them, insisting this was temporary, a glitch, sabotaged by some hidden traitor. Yet deep down I knew the truth. He was the traitor, not to his species but to my illusions. He had inverted the battlefield without lifting a weapon. The lights steadied suddenly, but the calm was worse than the chaos. My console flickered once and displayed a series of orbital patterns I did not recognize. Cloaked satellites, hidden arrays, signals we had never detected. The human leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of revelation. "You thought Earth was defenseless. You thought we hadn't seen you coming. But we've had eyes in the dark for a long time." My crew recoiled as the data poured across the screens. Undeniable, irrefutable. He was not bluffing. He was demonstrating. The networks, the monitors, the hidden guardians of his world. They had been waiting, concealed beneath a veil of incompetence. I wanted to scream, to demand why, but the answer was etched into his calm gaze. They had chosen to appear primitive because it was the most effective camouflage. One of my officers whispered, "Florida man," as if invoking a myth. The human smiled faintly. "You thought he was an accident. He wasn't. He was a test case. Proof of concept. Chaos as a weapon." The alarms ceased. Silence settled like dust. The human exhaled slowly, leaning back against the restraints that now looked more symbolic than functional. "You know," he said, "we didn't win wars by outgunning our enemies. We won by outlasting them, by letting them underestimate us. You're not the first." His words hollowed me. The chamber felt smaller, suffocating, as though the very walls pressed inward. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that our empire had conquered worlds older, stronger, wiser than his. But the truth curdled in my throat. None of them had smiled like this. None of them had dismantled us with mere conversation. Then the final strike fell. The central AI, our loyal intelligence, spoke in a voice stripped of emotion. Primary command rerouted, awaiting human authorization. Every officer turned to me, eyes wide with horror. My authority was gone. My ship, my pride, my carefully cultivated superiority gone. He closed his eyes, not gloating, not triumphant, but calm, steady, inevitable. "It's over," he murmured. Not with fire, not with blood, just with silence, patience, and duct tape. The last phrase was meaningless to us, yet it chilled me more than any threat could. I felt something unfamiliar then, something I had not known since my earliest cadet years, fear. Not of pain, not of death, but of irrelevance. Of realizing that the war we thought finished had never truly begun, because the enemy we dismissed had only just revealed itself. When the chamber finally unlocked, my crew did not move. They looked to me for orders I could not give. My words had withered. My pride had collapsed. All I could do was watch as the human sat there, composed, a quiet storm cloaked in the body of a primitive mammal. And so, I end this account not with arrogance, but with humility. We thought the battle was over, but perhaps it was only the prologue. Humanity's shock troops had entered the field, not soldiers with guns, but minds sharpened by secrecy and patience. They had prepared while we had laughed. They had advanced while we had dismissed. And when they arrived, they did not announce themselves with trumpets of war. They arrived with a smile,